Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. The heat that day was not the kind that broke you in an hour. It was the slow, patient sort that followed a man home and laid a hand on his shoulder, and then another, until the weight of it bent his spine. John Avery rode beneath it without complaint. He had learned there was no arguing with sky or weather. He rode like a needle through cloth, stitching his way along the low ridges that circled his spread, the reins resting easy in his hand. His mare's ears switching at flies dot the New Mexico territory in late summer was a choir of small noises, grasshoppers ticking from blade to blade, the faint creak of saddle leather, a distant hawk's single note, out beyond the cottonwoods that marked the arroyo. A mirage shimmered and unstitched itself, stitched and unstitched, as if the world couldn't make up its mind what was true. John had been out since first light. A stray yearling had taken to slipping through a gap in the north fence, and he'd repaired it with wire and a curse, then followed a line of churned earth where a storm river had knifed through a month earlier. At a sinkhole, he found a half-buried skull, not man, but steer, and he turned it with his boot before leaving it to sun and ants. He ate his lunch in the shade of a cottonwood, jerky, and a heel of bread, washing it down with water so warm it tasted like iron. On the back ride, he kept to the high ground, eyes narrowing as the land flattened into familiar. His homestead came into view as a tilt of roofs and a squint of windows, a windmill turning with the barest breath, complaining in a long, tired squeal. The house was simple plank and stubbornness. The barn, bigger than it needed to be for the stock he kept, loomed like a storm cloud beside it. He and his late brother had raised that barn in a single winter, hammering by lantern light when the days were too short for anything but work. The brother was buried now behind the stand of Osage orange, and the barn stood as if it had always been there. The mare the gray he called Lark tossed her head when they came within 100 yards. John felt the shift through the saddle like a cough. She wasn't spooked, exactly, just listening. "Easy," he said, his voice a dry scrape. "Home, girl?" She settled, but he did not. As they reached the outer corral, the cattle lifted, their muzzles in a slow, synchronized motion, then blew air like they had each rehearsed it alone and were trying to match each other. A few paced. The bull, a slab of horn and temper, craned toward the barn and pawed the dust once, twice. In the shade under the eaves, John's barn cat, an indifferent calico that tolerated him only as a provider of mice, sat, with its tail wound around its paws, ears pricked, eyes fixed. A swinging soundwood tapping wood punctured the quiet. John turned his gaze and saw the barn door drifting, not wide, not shut, rubbing the jamb on its lazy hinge. He had latched it that morning, he was sure. Habit lived where memory sometimes failed. His hands did the same things in the same order, because a ranch needed a ritual of small certainties. He swung down from Lark, feeling the pull in his knees. He left her ground tied, looped the reins once, and rested his palm on her neck a second longer than usual. The cattle rustled like a rumor. The windmill gave a sigh dot. His hand went to the worn grip of the Colt without urgency. He had long ago decided that nothing good came quick, but quickness was needed when bad things were already on you. He thumbed the hammer till it kissed the first notch. The day seemed to draw nearer, as if the air decided to listen. Dot between the house and the barn lay a patch of dirt with old wagon ruts fossilized in it. John walked there now, slow, eyes lowered. Tracks, that was the first thing to look for. If you asked the right questions with your eyes, the ground would answer. He found boot prints, one good set, the right heel worn down, the left almost new. The gait was uneven, as if the person had stepped on a stone and then kept stepping on it ever since. The stride was shorter than a man's, could be a boy, could be a woman. Hard to tell in baked earth. There were no horse prints nearby, nothing. Fresh. He crouched and touched the edge of one impression. The crumbly lip told him it was recent last few hours. He breathed out and straightened. The barn exhaled the smell of hay and leather and old manure. Light fell in from the high window as a sheet of gold dust, the motes dancing in it like they were in love with their own weightlessness. John stepped to the side of the door and slipped in, hugging the shadow. His eyes adjusted, and the barn became a cathedral of practical things. Racks of harness, a plow blade leaning against the far wall, bundles of rawhide, sacks of oats, a barrel of nails he'd bartered from a peddler with a broken axle. The ladder to the loft was right where it had been for 5 years, still missing the same third rung from the bottom. The stall closest to the door stood open, the straw inside matted and dark. He listened. The cattle's lowing thinned. A fly buzzed around his hat brim, and then thought better of it. Far off, a raven made a comment to the empty sky and got no answer. He took a step, then another. The floor creaked in the specific way of that floor. Not a betraying sound, just a note in a song he knew by heart. He swept his gaze along the shadowed corners. A saddle stand near the tack wall had a wool blanket draped over it, striped and sun-faded. More a place to throw something than put something away. He would have passed it without thought any other day. But a corner of the blanket had slid, and beneath it lay a shape that did not belong, something small and irregular. A geometry of collapse. His mouth went dry. He was glad for the colt's weight. He took one more step and stopped where he could reach, if he had to, and also flee, if he had to. Keeping the barrel angled at the packed dirt, he lifted the blanket with the back of his free hand, the way you lift a curtain to see a storm through a window. "Please, don't touch me." The voice wasn't loud. It was thin as the line you draw through sand to show a man where not to step. It wasn't a threat or a plea you expect to hear in a barn you built with your brother's hands and your own. His heart did not leap. It paused. The pause was enough to make the blood in him feel like it had missed a step on a staircase. He felt the cold that wasn't there, the way a man feels the memory of a winter when a shadow crosses him in August. Under the blanket was a woman young, he thought, though desert and fear do their own aging. Dust streaked her hair and skin, as if the land itself had tried to claim her. Her dress, the color of prairie grass tinder, was torn at the shoulder and dark where it shouldn't be. Her cheekbone was marked purple, where a hand or a fall had found it. The first thing he saw were her eyes, open too wide, whites showing around the irises, searching not the world, but what the world could become. He let the blanket fall onto his forearm so she could see both his hands. "All right," he said, and heard the rasp of his own voice. "I won't." The Colt was suddenly indecent, a weapon in a church. He slid it into his belt, slow as sunrise, then spread his hands chest high, palms empty. She tried to scoot back, but there was nowhere to go. The saddle stand pinched her in. The wall behind her smelled of oil and rope. Her breath came in short, catching pulls, the way a horse breathes after it runs from something it doesn't understand. "Water," he said, more to the air than to her. "I'm going to get water." Her chin trembled once, almost a nod. He stepped back, careful, and she flinched anyway. The world sometimes teaches a body to anticipate pain, whether it arrives or not. Outside, the light seemed louder. He took the bucket from its hook by the back door, the tin cool against his palm, and set it under the pump. The pump handle had a pendulum rhythm to it, up-down with a small kick on the downstroke. He worked it till the stream came, first brown, then clear, and filled the dipper, tasting it himself to show it wasn't poison, and because the day had put a hard thirst in him. He went back inside with bucket and dipper and set them on the ground as if he were laying something delicate. "I'll leave it here," he said. "You take it how you like." Her gaze tore itself from his hands and pinned the water like a bird pins a seed. She reached not the grab of panic, but the cautious reach of someone who is used to trusts breaking under their own weight. "When?" The dipper was halfway to her mouth. She said again, in a voice smaller than the first time, "Please, don't. I won't touch you." He leaned sideways so she could see the distance he gave her. "You're safe for now. This is my barn, my land." The words felt strange coming out. He did not talk much past necessity. But the language of reassurance, even halting, seemed required, like the language of horses. "Easy, easy, I see you. I'm here." She drank, and water slipped a clean line down her chin and dropped into the dust. Her hand shook, and the dipper clinked against her teeth. When she finished, she held the dipper for a moment as if she had forgotten what to do with it, then placed it back with the slow attentiveness of a woman setting down a sleeping child. John crouched at an angle, near enough to speak to her without, making his voice a shout, far enough to show that his promise meant something. He put his forearm on his knee and let one hand dangle. He looked not at her, but nearby, at the knot in the wall plank, at a wisp of straw, at the old nail head that had a stain the shape of an old thumbprint. The barn swam in and out around her, the air full of hay dust and old metal. What happened? He asked. Silence filled the barn until it had a shape. He thought she wouldn't answer. When she did, it was like the first breath after surfacing. "Wrong men," she said. "Wrong road." He did not ask for names. Names have weights, and strangers' names can pull you under. He did not offer his either. He studied her again, without letting it feel like a study. The gash at her side had been wrapped with what looked like a strip, torn from her own slip. The cloth was stained brown and had dried stiff, then softened again with sweat. The ugly thing about wounds was not always the blood. It was the way they made the rest of the body hold itself around them, wary and careful, like a town closing its gates at dusk. He stood, his knees complaining, and walked a little to show he was neither looming nor creeping. He picked up a clean rag from the peg. He kept rags on pegs, because rags on floors became nests for mice, and set it on a bale within her reach. He added a small tin of carbolic, a roll of bandage he saved, for when wire bit him, a bundle of dried yarrow leaves his neighbor's wife had sworn could turn a bad thing toward better. He didn't push them toward her. He just made sure she could see them, the way you set out tools before a job so the job knows you're serious. "I have a doctor in town I call when it's more than I can fix," he said. "He's 2 hours. Ride if the wind's with you and the road's good. But I expect you don't want strangers just now." Her eyes flicked to the door, as if the word strangers might drag some in by its own gravity. A shadow of a shake, almost imperceptible. "All right," he said. "We'll do what we can hear." The barn swallowed the words like they were its own. He listened to the homestead sounds, the windmill's creak, the cattle's rustle, a loose shutter tapping once, twice. Over it all, the quiet roared. He moved to the stall post and checked the leather strap that served as a latch. It was still. Hooked, the ladder to the loft still missed the same rung. The signs of normalcy counted themselves off in his mind, and then a not normal one announced itself. On the dirt, just inside the threshold, a faint smear, not red now, but rusty, where dust had kissed it. It led in a broken path from the door to where she had curled herself small. He followed the line with his eyes, and then let them wander outward again, over the boards, the shadows, the dust. He looked for the kind of mistake a hider makes footprints. They forget. A corner of cloth out from under a blanket, a breath louder than it needs to be. He found instead the kind of mistake a pursuer makes. Nothing at all. The barn had only the one set of tracks. No heavy boot, No sprawled spurs, no scatter from a scuffle. She had come in alone. That did not rest him. Men who were worth worrying about sometimes had patience enough to wait. He felt the old ache where memory lived. He had seen a woman shake like this once before, in a town that had 4 years of graves and 1 decent hotel. That woman had asked for a glass of water and then held it until the sun went down, because letting go of it felt too much like letting go of herself. The memory did not soften him. It hardened a thing inside him that had not had a reason to harden in a while. "I'm going to close the door," he said, slow, so the light doesn't jump. It keeps the barn cooler, and it keeps eyes out. He moved as he talked, one hand on the plank, easing it along its groove. The slice of day narrowed, and came to be the thin glow from the high window. The barn did not go dark. It went private. Her shoulders eased a hair. That was something. "Do you have a name I can call you?" he asked, still not looking. Direct, a long pause. He would have let it go if she'd kept it. At last she said, "Don't." He let the softest breath out through his nose. "Don't it is?" He straightened and felt the pull in his back. Work had written its signature in knots along his spine. "I can bring you more blankets. Food when you're ready. I've got a dog that thinks he owns this place. I'll tie him up for now so he doesn't add himself to your troubles." He eyed the gash again, an assessment without ownership. "You'll need to clean that, but you can take your time deciding how." She licked her cracked lower lip and nodded just once, as if she'd agreed not to die. He backed away a pace. The barn cat, convinced that something uncatlike was happening, but unwilling to miss it entirely, slunk along the feed bins with the stealth of one who believes stealth is its own reward. The cat sniffed the air, made a decision, and nosed itself out through the sun-slit door, tail high. In the doorway, John paused and tilted his head, listening not to the barn, but to the horizon. Sometimes the land told you things if you gave it your good ear. Far out, where heat made mirage and mirage made promise, he thought he heard the suggestion of hooves, a vibration more than a sound, the idea of horses rather than horses themselves. It could have been his own blood, roused from its cold too. Its ordinary work. It could have been wind. It could have been nothing. He filed it in the part of himself that kept weather and worry and odds. He looked back at the blanket where she lay. Her eyes were half closed now, not in trust, but in the way of a person hoarding the little strength they still owned. A strand of hair stuck to her cheek. Her hands were tucked in, fists closed as if the barn held a storm, at arm's length, and she was bracing against the pressure. The words she had used hung in the air between them, like a fence you can ride along for a long way without finding a gate. "Please, don't touch me." He had heard the ranch talk at the trading post. Often enough, the men who were brave in stories and less brave when the stories asked something of them. He had also heard cricket talk and coyote talk, and the talk of old women who knew when rains were liars. This sounded like a different language altogether. It said the world had taught her a lesson she did not want to relearn. "All right," he said again, as if agreement were a ritual that needed repeating. "Nobody touches you here." He stepped out into the white light and pulled the door to, leaving it not quite latched so the barn would breathe. The yard greeted him with the ordinary, lark cropping at a patch of dry grass as if it were manna. The bull considering whether to lean against the fence and deciding against it this time. A cloud sketched so thin above the mesa that a man with a pencil and a little practice could have drawn it. John moved with purpose now. He filled a second bucket and left it by the pump. He tied his dog a rangy, earnest thing with a limp earned from a porcupine under the porch, where shade was deepest, and sternly explained that guarding would be done from there today. The dog disagreed with his whole body, and then agreed with his eyes. John fetched a thin quilt from the cedar chest, one his mother had pieced with leftover calicos when the boys were young. He hesitated a heartbeat quilts accumulate ghosts with use, and then carried it to the barn along with a tin plate, a heel of bread softened with a little milk, and 2 apples that had seen better days. He set the things where she could reach. Without rose or speech, he did not try to make her eat. The day had climbed to the place in the sky where the creek smelled of sun, and the insects traded their shift. He checked the latch on the pasture gate and the hinge on the back door, the way a man runs his hand over the edges of his life when something new is edged in. Before the light went to gold, he saddled Lark again and rode a slow circle around the home ground, letting the mare's hooves write questions the land might answer. He found nothing he could swear to. He found enough maybes to fill a saddlebag, a scuff on a rock where a boot might have slipped, a tuft of mesquite with a thread of cloth, not of the color his own shirts came in, a faint smell of tobacco where he himself had not smoked in a week. He gathered the maybes and stored them with the earlier rumor of hooves. The land makes liars, of both fear and confidence. It asks you to believe without proof, and to prepare as if proof were due any minute. When he returned, the barn was the barn, and also not. He stepped inside, adjusting to the dim, and listened. Her breathing had evened. Sleep, then a thin sleep, he would bet, but sleep all the same, and sleep was medicine that did not need boiling. He took off his hat and hung it on the peg. He sat on an upturned crate, a good 10 feet away, and rolled a strip of rawhide between. His fingers, the old habit of a man who had stopped whittling when he ran out of things to whittle. He watched the dust ladder in the shaft of light, watched it climb and fall and climb again, and thought about what it meant. A person under his roof who did not want a hand laid on her, even to help. He had always trusted silence more than speech. Now the silence had a new shape in it, a human one. He studied that shape the way he studied weather, fences, the way a cow looks at a storm. There were questions he could ask, lines he could draw in his mind. But questions and lines could wait. Some things you met head on. Some things you rode alongside a while until they got used to you. Evening found the windmill turning with less complaint. The sun slanted and painted the floorboards into long bands. A fly batted itself against the window as if it wanted to be the last thing alive to greet the night. John stood. He dropped the bar across the barn doors quietly, not to wake, not to alarm. He went to the house and lit the lamp and then turned it low, because light announces life. He laid his rifle across the table where he could reach it, from anywhere between stove and door. He put coffee on, not because he wanted it, but because the smell of coffee can steady a house. The dog thumped its tail twice, a muted drum roll, and then slept like the dead. Out beyond the far pasture, coyotes began their first remarks. A night bird called something that sounded like a question asked twice. The sky, indifferent to men and their barns and their blankets, kept being the sky. John poured himself a cup and let it cool in his hands and looked toward the barn as if he could look through wood. He had lifted that blanket and felt the temperature of his blood drop to something he remembered from a winter of 2 stoves and not enough wood. He had heard words that rearranged the room they were spoken in. He had agreed to terms set by a stranger who had no strength left to enforce them. He did not know what was coming. He knew only the rules he would set for his small piece of the world. When the first star landed and held, he got up and went to the doorway, and there he stood in the oblong of the night, a man carved from habit and choice. The ranch breathed its slow breath. In the barn, a woman slept under a stranger's roof, with a stranger's promises around her like a fence. "Please, don't touch me," the day had said, and he had answered it. Outside, somewhere too far to be certain, and just near enough to trouble a cautious man. The faintest suggestion of hooves moved through the dark like a thought you tried to ignore. John listened to it, and to the silence braided through it, and let the coffee go cold in his hand. John rose before the light had fully made up its mind. The coffee heat left on the stove had put a brown ring on the iron. He warmed what was left and let it go bitter on purpose. Bitter kept a man alert. Through the window he could make out the long black box of the barn, and beyond it the pale suggestion of the mesa. Nothing moved but wind. He crossed the yard with a bucket and a purpose. He didn't go straight in. He stood to the side of the doors and called low through the crack, "I'm coming in. I'll keep my distance." A beat. The barn absorbed and returned the scrape of a voice. All right. He eased the door enough to slip through. The air inside was cool and smelled of hay and old rain. She was still near the saddle stand, the blanket pulled to her collarbone, eyes clearer than last night and rimmed red as though they had been busy when he wasn't looking. The tin cup lay on its side, a thread of water darkening the dust. He set the bucket and a folded towel down where she could reach. He added a clean shirt of his plain white cotton he saved for Sundays, now pressed into weekday service. He laid it, folded, on the bale and did not glance at her torn dress. There were ways to be polite that didn't require words. "I boiled water," he said, "and cloths. Carbolic in this tin. It stings. I'll talk you through what to do, and I won't lay a hand on you." She watched him like a moray watches a man with a rope measuring how much of his talk will be matched by his actions. When she nodded, it was a small nod, but it was there. He moved back and sat on an upturned feed bucket crooked from years of use. He took off his hat and set it brimmed down a sign to himself that he meant to stay a while. Between them he placed what he'd gathered, the bandage roll, the yarrow, a length of boiled thread in a jar, a needle he had scrubbed till it shone. He did not intend to stitch her. That was doctor's work. But if it came to it, and she allowed it, he would try, and regret if trying made things worse. "First the old cloth," he said. "Slow as you like. If it pulls, wet it, let it soften, then try again." He turned his face a few degrees away, fixing his eyes on a knot in the wall. He had learned long ago that privacy can be given by where you aim your attention. The sounds were small, the breath through teeth, the whisper of fabric separating from skin, a hiss when carbolic met raw. He kept his hands flat on his thighs, feeling the temptation to offer them, and letting it pass like a weather thought. "Good," he said, when the work's little noises stopped. "Now rinse with clean water, not hot, just warm. Wipe outward. You're washing the trail away from the cut, not into it." She followed his words, at first stiff, then steadier. He could hear the focus in her, the way a person sets their mind to one small job when the larger job is too big to look at. She tore the shirt into strips with care, using the seam as a guide the way a good hand uses a fence line. When she wrapped the fresh bandage, the pressure in her breath told him she had pulled firm enough to help and not so firm as to harm. "Eat when you can," he said, pointing his chin at the plate without looking. "Bread's soft. Apples. Mostly good if you work around the spots. I've got coffee if you want it, or milk, water," she said. The word was a stone dropped in a pond. He poured and slid the dipper along the floor. Her fingers hesitated, then took it. They let the morning build slowly between them, a thing made as much by what they didn't say as by what they did. He asked no questions that required more than a yes or no. He asked things like, "Dizzy? And fever? And how bad is the sting?" She answered in a voice that seemed to be relearning its job. He caught a trace of education in it, not the book kind exactly, but the habit of choosing her words. Outside, the windmill ticked through a full hour. John stood once to throw open the high window and let the ammoniac smell lift. When he sat, again, he angled the crate so if anyone opened the door behind him, they'd see him first and not her. He set his rifle across his lap, as if it had always lived there. "I'm not going to town yet," he said, anticipating a fear she hadn't voiced. "It would mean leaving you here alone. I won't do that unless there's a need." He thought of the doctor's steady hands, of gauze cut into perfect squares. "If the wound goes wrong, I'll have to go anyway." She didn't look up. "You can lock me in." "I don't lock people," he said. Then, after a small pause, "Doors keep out weather. People should keep out trouble on their own." Her mouth twitched. It might have been an almost smile, or a muscle remembering how, "You can call me Miss for now," she said, as if offering the smallest coin she had. "If you need to." "Miss," he said. "I'm John." She didn't give his name back to him. Names were trust, and trust was a thing that took its time. He took the coil of baling twine he had brought and tied it to the barn door and then to a coffee can filled with nails, balanced on a peg. "Wind won't move it," he explained. "But a hand will. If it tips, we'll hear it." She watched the can the way a person watches a horizon line. "They were 5, she said, so softly he almost missed it. "Sometimes 6. One with a red." She stopped and touched her own upper arm. "Here." He didn't look at the place she indicated on himself or her. He pictured it in the mind where pictures don't hurt anyone. A strip of red cloth tied hard enough to leave a mark when it came off. Something a man would wear when he wanted to be remembered, or to make his remembering easy. "How far behind you?" he asked. 2 days, she said. "Maybe 1. If they found a string of fresh horses." She closed her eyes like someone pressing a memory back into place. They don't hurry unless they think hurrying will make someone else suffer. Asterisk he filed this among the other maybes that were becoming certainties. Red on an arm, 5, sometimes 6. Not hurried, which meant experienced or lazy. He knew enough men of that sort to guess at their habits. They'd take a straight line when a crooked line would have been kinder. They'd camp where they could see the most road. They'd leave their fire banked, because banking a fire is like carrying forward a bad intention. He stood. "I'm going to walk the North Ridge." He sighed. "Not long. I'll take the far path so you can hear me if I come back quick. You'll have the dog." He didn't wait for approval. He'd given her the basics and would keep giving them until she told him to stop Dot in the yard. The dog watched him with a seriousness that bordered on worry. John crouched to put the rope in the dog's mouth and then changed his mind and put it in the dog's mind instead. "Stay. Speak only if I don't." The dog accepted the new job like it accepted all jobs, with full heart and a limp. The North Ridge showed him what a careful eye had already guessed. Far across the flats, dust lay in a faint smear, too regular to be wind alone. It wasn't a moving plume, no riders just then, but the memory of movement, hours old. He peered through the little spyglass he kept for counting cattle on distant pasture. Heat shook the edges of what he saw, but he made out fence posts, the cut of the arroyo, a rag of canvas snagged on a mesquite thorn. Nothing else. Asterisk back at the barn, he tapped the door with his knuckles before entering. The can didn't tip. Inside, she had managed the shirt half over her dress, making a clean layer against her skin. The torn fabric lay folded, not discarded. People who fold even ruined things are people who've had to make use of worse. "Food in an hour," he said. "Broth. You can take it outside if you want the air. Or I can leave it, and you can take your time." She glanced at the door, and something in the look tugged at him. "Outside," she said, as if saying the word might make it safer to do. "But close." He set a stool in the shade just beyond the threshold, where the barn's interior could still be seen. He faced a crate toward the yard for himself, so if he kept his promise about distance, he would still be between her and whatever came. When the broth was ready, he brought it in a tin cup and set it on the threshold, then stepped back and took his seat. He ate bread because something about two people eating at the same time makes a space less sharp. She sat slowly, one hand on the door jamb, not to hold herself up, but to assure herself that the door was still there. She raised the cup and drank with small sips, wincing once and then settling into it. They watched the same piece of yard. The dog lay with its chin on its paws, pretending to sleep. A blue-bottle fly batted at the bucket and failed to understand why it could not pass through iron. Out by the far fence, a jackrabbit took 3 long leaps and sat to consider its own decisions. "How long have you had this place?" she asked, not looking at him. "Years," he said. "Long enough that even the mistakes look like they were part of the plan." He nodded at the barn. "Built the frame in 1 winter. My brother and me." She let the word brother hang, then lifted her eyebrows a fraction. He answered the unasked. "Dead," he said. 3 years. Fever took the town that winter. Took him too. "I'm sorry," she said. The words sounded like she meant them, and also like she couldn't afford to mean them too much. "Me as well." He took a drink of coffee gone to vinegar. "You from town?" "No town I'd name," she said. "No people I'd send you to." She turned the cup in her hand, studying its dents. "If there was a map drawn of where I've been lately, I'd throw it in the stove." He thought about maps and how they lied. "You can stay here until you can stand a longer road," he said. "I'll ask for nothing but the truth when you're ready to say it. And if you can't say it, I'll leave the truth alone." She looked at him then, not a hard look, not a soft one. "And if the men come, then they'll have to rethink their day." He said it in the same voice he used when telling a calf to go around the gate instead of through it. Not brave, just plain. She studied the yard again. "They ride under no flag," she said, as if his steadiness cost her something, and she wanted to return it in information. "They like to say they work for whoever pays most, but they are their own cause." The red on his arm, that one he wears it so the people who live through him won't forget. He likes to be the color in a story. Men like that, John said, mostly end up being the color in a stain. A flicker. It could have been approval. It could have been nothing. The sun moved. The shade line crept. He shifted the stool without comment, so she did not have to choose between heat and the threshold. When her hands shook halfway through the broth, he pretended to get up for no reason at all, and came back a minute later, so she could steady herself without feeling watched. He noticed the way she held the cup thumb high, fingers long. He noticed she had a small scar on the knuckle of her right forefinger, shaped like a crescent moon, the kind you get from catching your hand on wire and not making a fuss about it. Late afternoon found him stringing a second line from the corral fence to a bell at the porch. It would sound if something larger than a coyote crossed at the low wash. He set a mirror in the house window angled, so he could see the barn door from the table without having to stand. None of it was a fortress. It was simply the best a man could do in a day if he meant to farm the dark as carefully as he farmed the light. He did not expect gratitude, and did not receive it. What he received instead was a small, precise sentence that came as she folded the blanket at dusk and set it neatly beside her. "I can walk," she said, meaning to the water, the privy, as far as she needed. "Slow. I will not go far." "All right," he said. "There's a lantern by the stall. If you take it out, turn the wick down so it doesn't throw far." She stood, keeping her weight away from the bandaged side, and took 2 testing steps into the yard. The first was careful, the second nearly bold. The third, a compromise. The dog lifted its head, then decided this counted as ordinary and put its head down again. She walked to the pump, leaned her hip against it, and drew 2 cups of water, letting the second run cool over her wrist, watching it move as if water were a new invention. When she turned back, she stopped at the threshold, lifted her eyes to meet his, and gave a nod that was not thanks and was not nothing. Inside, the barn settled into evening. He brought a small mirror, and without comment, placed it on the bale, with the other things so she could see her work if she needed to. He set down a knife, sharp and honest, in its sheath. "For you," he said, "if you rest better with it in reach." She drew it out halfway, noted the clean grind of the edge, the tight fit of the handle to her palm. She slid it back and laid the sheath under the blanket where her hand would find it in the dark without thinking. "Don't come near me at night," she said. It wasn't a warning. It was a rule of the house as necessary as banking the stove. "I won't," he said. "I'll be on the porch or at the table. If you need me, call. If you don't, we'll both keep breathing." As he turned to go, her voice stopped him like a bridle does a horse. It wasn't force, just the knowledge of how movement works. "John," he waited. "If they come, they will call me something I'm not. They'll make it sound like the name matters." Her jaw tightened. "Don't listen when they use it?" "All right," he said. "I'll listen to you." He left her with the lantern turned low and the barn door barred at the top, but not the bottom, the way a man bars a door when he trusts someone on one side of it to open it if they must. On the porch, he sat with his rifle and the coffee that had gone cold on him a second time and watched the rectangle of dark that was the door's crack. The wind shifted. Somewhere to the north, a night hawk cut its curve across the failing blue. He thought of the red cloth on a man's arm and of 5 riders who didn't hurry. He thought of how a promise can be as steady as a post if you set it right, and how easily it can splinter if you lean on it wrong. He listened to the small sounds, the dog's dream bark, the ticking of the cooling stove, the bell on the string breathing as the air changed, and to one larger sound that came just before the first star. Far-off hooves, faint as a rumor, steady as a plan. He didn't count them. Counting would come later. For now, there was the woman asleep in his barn with a knife in her reach, a bandage he hadn't touched, and a rule set plain as a brand. "Please don't," she had said. He hadn't. And the night arranged itself around that fact. The morning broke pale, a weak gray light washing over the desert like a memory instead of a promise. John Avery was up before it, stoking the stove, the kettle muttering to itself. He poured coffee into the same chipped mug he'd used for 10 years, and the bitterness carried him out the door. He paused on the porch. The land was still, the kind of stillness that came before the ground decided to speak. The dog lifted its head and whined, ears stiff toward the north. John narrowed his eyes in that direction. The mesa was a black cut against the sky, and in the trough of light below it, a smear of dust was rising. He didn't move right away. He just stood with the mug cooling in his hands and watched the smear lengthen, dissolve, then return. It was the steady kind of dust, not the flurried kind. Wind makes horses, riders, more than a couple. Hell, he muttered dot. He went back inside, laid the mug on the table, and lifted the rifle. Then he crossed the yard to the barn, boots crunching loud enough to announce him. He didn't want her startled into silence when he needed her voice. "I'm coming in," he called, tapping twice on the door. The reply came quicker than yesterday, though still thin. "All right." She was awake, sitting cross-legged on the blanket, the borrowed knife across her lap. The bandage at her side was clean, but already spotted through. She'd slept little, he could tell by the shadows under her eyes, but she held herself upright, as if she refused to let weariness be seen. "They're coming," he said. No point softening it. Her eyes flared once, then narrowed. How many? 5, maybe 6. Hard to say from the ridge. She closed her eyes, breathed once through her nose, then opened them. Red cloth? Couldn't see yet. She reached down, touched the hilt of the knife, as if reminding herself it was real. It will be him. John crouched, careful to. Keep distance. They'll come straight here. Place is too visible. I told them yesterday there was nothing here but me and cattle. They'll want to test if I lied. Her throat worked as she swallowed. If they find me, they won't. You don't know them. I don't need to. His voice was steady, but inside he felt the old tremor, the one that came before a storm you couldn't stop, only brace against. She looked at him, then really looked, her eyes the hard green of mesquite after a dry spell. You'll kill them if you have to. I'll do what keeps this place standing. For a long beat, she said nothing. Then, very slowly, she leaned forward and pressed the knife into his hand. If they take me, you end it. You don't let them drag me back. His blood went cold again. Not from fear, he'd known fear, and this wasn't it. It was from the weight of what she was asking, heavier than the colt on his hip, heavier than any fence post he'd set in this dry soil. I'll fight them, he said. That's what I'll do. Her hand lingered on the knife until she was sure he understood. Then she sat back, folding into herself. Then fight hard. They came by noon, 5 silhouettes against the sun, then 6 when one lagged up from the rear. Horses lathered, guns easy on hips, dust rising in banners. Behind them, John stood at the fence line, rifle across his arms like a man resting, not a man ready to kill. The cattle bunched, uneasy, the bull blowing steam from his nose. The leader rode ahead. Big man, wide in the shoulders, red cloth tied high on his left arm. His horse was black, restless, but the man sat it calm, as if both beast and man shared the same cruel patience. Morning, rancher, the leader called, voice carrying easy. We're looking for someone. John spat into the dirt. Plenty of someones pass through this country. Which one do you want? The man grinned, white teeth against a sunburned face. Young woman, brown hair. Slipped out of our care. Few days back. Ours by right. John shook his head. Ain't seen her. Just cattle and dust out here. The man leaned forward on the saddle horn. Funny thing. We've got reason to think she came this way. Horses know the smell of fear, and your cattle look spooked. They're cattle, John said evenly. They spook at shadows. Behind the leader, one of the riders thin, rat-eyed laughed. Maybe we should check his barn. Might find more than hay in there. The leader held up a hand, silencing him. His gaze fixed on John, steady, measuring. We'll be back, rancher. And if we find you're lying. He let the threat hang, like a rope waiting for a neck. Then he wheeled his horse, the others. Following, dust swallowing them again as they rode north along the ridge. John stood there long after they were gone, rifle heavy in his hands. His breath came slow, controlled, but his jaw ached from clenching. When he finally went inside, she was standing by the stall door, blanket clutched around her. They'll come back, she said flatly. I know. You can't fight 6. Alone. Maybe not. He leaned the rifle against the wall, rubbed a hand over his face. But this is my land, and I've seen men try to take what ain't theirs. Sometimes the land eats them first. She closed her eyes, shoulders trembling once, then steadying. Then we make them bleed. John studied her frail, wounded, trembling, but with a steel under the skin that no cut could bleed out. He thought of the knife she'd given him, of the look in her eyes when she said end it. He thought of the red cloth on the man's arm, bright as blood against the sky. The West had its own rules, written not in law, but in dust and death. He knew what was coming. He just didn't know if either of them would be alive when it passed. The wind turned that night. It carried the scent of mesquite smoke and the faint metallic tang of iron, as though the land itself was warning John Avery that men were drawing near. He sat on the porch with his rifle across his knees, the dog, curled under the steps, ears twitching at sounds too far for a man to hear. Inside the barn, Clara, still the only name he had for, shifted restlessly, the knife under her blanket never far from her hand. John had not told her what he had. Seen on the ridge that afternoon, the 6 riders splitting into 2 groups, circling wide, testing the ranch like wolves test a herd. He had not told her that he had counted their shadows by the lowering sun and found that each shadow leaned toward violence. He had simply said, "They'll come at dawn," and she had nodded as if she had always known. The waiting the night dragged like a bad song. Every tick of the windmill sounded like a boot on gravel. Every coyote's bark was a rider's whistle. John forced himself to breathe steady, to clean his rifle slow, to sip coffee that was more grit than drink. He was a man who had lived by patient seasons, herds, weather, but waiting for men was a patience that rotted a man from the inside. Clara stepped out once, barefoot, wrapped in the quilt, her face a pale blur in the starlight. She didn't speak. She just stood beside him, looking north where the land dipped toward the flats. Then she went back in, quiet as a shadow. John thought of what she had asked of him, to end her life before letting them drag her back, and his hands shook. Once before he stilled them. Toward dawn, the dog rose, hackle stiff, and gave a low growl. John laid a hand on its head, whispering, "Easy." His own heart had already heard what the dog had. The faint, measured thud of hooves, the sound of men who thought themselves hunters. The arrival, they came with the sunrise behind them. 6. Black shapes cutting the light, rifles slung easy, pistols loose in their holsters. At their head rode the man with the red cloth on his arm. The morning painted him in fire, as if he were born from it. He raised a hand, and the riders fanned out, circling the yard. "Morning, rancher," he called, voice smooth as whiskey gone. "Sour. We're back for what's ours." John stood at the fence line, rifle in hand, every line of his body calm. "Ain't nothing here for you." The man's grin was wide and cruel. "We'll see about that." He spurred his horse forward, the others closing like a net. One dismounted and started for the barn. The cattle bawled, pressing against the far fence, sensing the storm before it broke. "Stop there," John said, leveling the rifle. The man at the barn door hesitated, but the leader barked, "Go on." He won't shoot first. That was the moment John chose. The rifle cracked like thunder, and the man at the door crumpled, blood spreading across the dust. The horse reared, screaming. Silence. Held for half a breath. Then the world exploded. The fight gunfire split the morning, sharp and merciless. The riders fired from their saddles, bullets tearing splinters from the fence. John dropped behind a trough, chambering another round, his hands moving with the steady rhythm of long practice. He fired once, saw another rider pitch sideways, clinging to his horse before falling limp. They came hard, circling, shouting, smoke rising around him. John felt the heat of a bullet graze his arm, tearing cloth and skin, but he did not falter. He fired again, the kick of the rifle grounding him in the chaos. Then the barn door burst open. Clara stood there, pale but unshaken, the revolver he had left on the workbench in her hands. Her arms trembled, but her aim did not. She fired once, the shot wild, but the second found its mark. A rider spinning from the saddle, dust swallowing him whole. The leader roared, wheeling his black horse. "She's mine," he shouted, rage dripping from the words. John rose from behind the trough, blood on his sleeve, eyes like stone. Not today. The two men locked eyes across the yard, the kind of stare that decides who walks away before the guns do. And both moved at once. The leader drew, red cloth flashing, but John was faster. His bullet caught the man in the chest, just below the red band. The rider jerked, mouth open in a silent curse, then toppled from the saddle. The red cloth fluttered loose, landing in the dust like a flag surrendering to the earth. The last two riders, seeing their leader fall, spurred their horses away, vanishing into the horizon, cowards swallowed by distance. The aftermath, the yard fell silent, but for the groaning of the wounded and the ragged breath of horses. Smoke drifted, mingling with the morning light. John lowered the rifle, chest heaving, the weight of survival pressing heavier than the fight itself. That Clara stepped from the barn, revolver still in hand, eyes wide, chest rising and falling. She looked at the bodies, at the blood soaking into the dust, and then at John Dot. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "It's done?" He nodded, wiping sweat and blood from his brow. "It's done." The revolver slipped from her fingers, clattering to the ground. She swayed, and John took a step toward her, then stopped, remembering. Her eyes flicked to him, wary even now. "Please," she said, voice breaking like glass. "Don't touch me." John froze, hands at his sides. "All right," he said softly. She sank to her knees, staring at the red cloth in the dust, the symbol of her tormentor, now nothing more than a rag. Her shoulders shook, silent sobs tearing loose, but she kept her arms wrapped tight around herself, refusing the comfort of another's touch. John stood nearby, watching, helpless, the weight of his promise heavy as iron. He knew he would never forget the moment he had lifted that blanket in his barn, when her words had frozen his blood. And now, even with the danger past, those words still bound him tighter than chains. "Please, don't touch me." The West was full of graves and ghosts, and now his ranch had inherited both.